So instead of doing something academic and scholarly for my presentation, I decided to do the history of drag and drag queens. I decided to start with a quote from author Jeffrey Self, who wrote a very, very good book on drag. Drag is armor, darling, no matter how you look at it. A good lace front wig and the right contouring are as strong as a bulletproof vest as I've ever needed. Which, word. So before we got into the presentation, I wanted to make something very clear, which is the difference between gender identity versus drag, which I know can be a very fine line. Basically, gender identity is how you feel on the inside. Gender is a spectrum, but it is also an identity and a foundation of your sense of self, versus drag, which is a persona. It is a character. It is the way that you express yourself with makeup and fashion, and it is an art. It is a pursuit of aesthetics. It is a recreational activity. It is very true that trans history and drag history overlap a lot. However, I'm not going to include that in this presentation because if I did, it would be 1.5 million years long, even though it is very, very interesting. So the first point of history with drag is the ancient rituals that involve cross-dressing. So some of the past civilizations that have been recorded to have rituals that involve cross-dressing include the Native Americans, the indigenous South Americans, which include the Aztecs and the Maya, as well as ancient Egyptians. And the purpose of men putting on women's clothing is to ward off spirits, summon rain, as well as call on the gods. Cross-dressing is also pretty frequently seen in mythology around the world. In Norse mythology, Thor dresses up as another goddess, Freya, in order to get his hammer back, which was stolen by a troll, and Odin dresses up as a goddess to seduce another goddess. And in Greek mythology, Athena often disguises herself as a man to check up on her followers. Tiresias the prophet was transformed into a woman, and Hercules was imprisoned and made to dress and act like a woman. And in Hindu mythology, the Mahabharata, which I think is how you pronounce that, were a group of men exiled from their village, so they dressed up as women to escape safely. And the god Krishna, the destroyer, his devotees often cross-dress as well. And on the left, you have Thor dressed up as Freya, and on the left you have a Bollywood movie starring a cross-dressing devotee of Krishna's. Drag history point number 2 is the theater. And we're talking ancient theater, like the Greeks and the Japanese. Why is it not going? Oh, this is where I messed it up. Okay, my apologies. So in both Greek and Japanese theater, women were strictly not allowed to participate. In Greece, they had male actors use these kind of creepy and disturbing masks to portray women. And in Japan, where this practice is called kabuki, which was very popular in the 17th century, it involves intricate makeup as well as strict training for all of the actors involved to make them move more feminine, sound more feminine, and as you can see, they dress in very flamboyant outfits. And actually, this art form is still popular today. But a couple centuries later, the English Renaissance theater happens, and the English Renaissance is classified as being from 1562 to 1662, and this is actually where the term drag originates. When the male actors would put on their female costumes, which included, long skirts, long dresses. They said that they dragged across the floor in ways that they weren't used to. So boom, drag. Women on stage was considered improper at this time. It was considered extremely inappropriate to show their bodies off on stage. In the beginning, cross-dressing in the theater started in recreations of scenes from the Bible in a church, but it soon gained so much popularity that it moved away from the church into its own theaters. And thanks to Shakespeare, authors like Shakespeare, plays became the big hot thing. And one of the greatest actors who ever played Ophelia in Hamlet was a man. Okay, vaudeville is considered the catalyst. I consider the catalyst of drag moving forward. Vaudeville, if you don't know, is basically theater pick and mix. It has singing, dancing, acrobatics, anything you could think of. But one of these star types of performers were known as female impersonators. And they did what they called caricatures of women, which were very dramatic personas. You could even call them patronizing a little bit. They had characters like the wench, who was the scary old woman who lived in the forest and ate kids. There was the prima donna, who was the princess who was in charge of everything. And they were comedic acts, and they were extremely popular up until around the 1930s, which is when things started to change. But this is not the queer cultural staple it is today. This female impersonation business belonged to straight white men, and that is very important to know. And here are some of my favorite drag drag queens. They were female impersonators at this time, as you can see with the hair and the makeup. But 1930s is where it really, really started to change. And this is where we see the drag queens that we know today. So there's this practice called sexology, which is the study of the male and female sexes. But as these sexology scientists figured out or hypothesized in the 1930s that there is this third sex, which is a feminine man or a masculine woman who desires members of the same sex. So like gender nonconforming gay or bisexual people. And this is where the whole intertwinement of gay males and drag begins, because this femininity was associated with homosexuality so closely. And the very first drag queens were gay men who dressed up as women. They performed in illegal gay bars, which at the time were subject to police raid. And there are some very, very gross anecdotes from drag queens who had been assaulted by police officers because the police officers were trying to check that their genitals matched their gender expression, which is very, very gross. But despite all this, this is what I call the slow cooker era of drag, because this is when the culture that we know today was kind of sitting and stewing and cooking up and marinating, which sounds weird, but that's kind of how it is. However, outside of the LGBT community, mainstream pop culture, drag was really looked at as something that was extremely weird. It is odd. It is out of the ordinary. It was used as comedy. It was laughed at. Men in dresses, what a ridiculous concept. Like, how can't we laugh at that? Here are some of the first true drag queens from across the decades. You can see 1930s, 40s, 50s, how the style and presentation changes. And here are some movie references from the mainstream. Some Like It Hot, which was a comedy, and then Norman Bates in Psycho, who dressed up like his mom. And now we get closer to what we know today, the drag revolution. And this is where things started to change. Oh, also known as the RuPaul Renaissance. Why is it not changing? Right. So this story happens in New York City in the 1980s and the 1990s. And there's this part of New York called the East Village, which was home to pretty much every sort of misfit, conceptual art, all kinds of weird stuff going on. But what really catapulted drag queens to the front of this whole weird scene was this event called Wigstock, which is like Coachella for drag queens in the 90s, which I can only imagine what that would be like. And it was founded by legendary drag queen Lady Bunny. And out of this culture, the first drag icons start to emerge, like Divine, who I think we all know as the queen who ate dog poop in Pink Flamingos and also served as the inspiration for Ursula in The Little Mermaid. In addition to this, the mainstream media started to admire drag queens a little bit more now, started treating them with a little bit more flattery, and included cult classics. Oh, and on the left we have Divine, on the right we have Lady Bunny, and some of those cult classics that I was speaking of include Paris is Burning and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, both, amazing movies. And this is when LGBT in the media started to spark to unprecedented levels, as we can see with RuPaul in the Ruvolution. RuPaul skyrocketed to fame when she starred in the B-52's music video Love Shack. She was popular in the drag scene before then, but this is what really got her up there. She rose in popularity when she started releasing her own music, and lo and behold, in 2009, RuPaul's Drag Race Season 1 aired, and the world was never, ever the same. And you can see the Vaseline on the camera lens quality that was Season 1, but it's okay. And now, after the advent of RuPaul's Drag Race going into the 21st century, we have modern herstory. And this is the culture as we know it today. Since 2009, RuPaul's Drag Race has 12 seasons and 100 plus queens, including spin-offs. Multiple queens have huge social media gatherings, over 1 million followers. But in addition to just being about drag, RuPaul's Drag Race has also highlighted other issues in the queer community, like messages of family, acceptance. Queens have been very, very open about struggles like addiction, eating disorders, in ways that prove that we can relate to each other regardless if we're, dressed up in wigs or not. In addition, social media has also been huge in the skyrocketing of drag to the very center of modern culture, proving that there are many different kinds of drag. As more people explore the art form of drag, people come up with their own ideas, their own concepts. There are campy drag queens, alternative drag queens, glamour drag queens, every single kind that you could think of. The diversity is absolutely amazing. And in the 21st century especially, drag has started to transcend gender identity and sexuality. Drag has a place for absolutely everyone. There are drag kings, which are women that dress up as men in very exaggerated makeup. There are trans drag artists before it would be considered taboo for a trans man or a trans female to be a queen, but now it's totally acceptable. And this is just a small sampling of the drag that's out there today. We have our alternative queens, our campy queens, our glamour queens. And each of them have their own message. It's their own art form. And I think it's important to remember that drag is not just, something that we see on TV. It's not just something to entertain us and then you switch off the TV and you go back to your life. This is a real art form that means a lot to people. That means a lot to queer people, especially because of the history with the community. And as a queer person myself, drag has been an amazing place to find acceptance, to find love among everyone, and